What connects the 21st century and 17th century? Piracy is condemned, and indeed, nobody likes losing their earnings, so piracy is bad. Well, yeah, probably, but that's not certain. In any case, software and game developers don't really like it when people steal their work. So they come up with all sorts of elaborate ways to protect software from copying, from Denuwo that eats up your computer's performance, which gets cracked in a couple of weeks anyway, to always online requirements and special license-checking chips in consoles. Well, actually, I've already told you about what protection was in Sony and Microsoft consoles and how ingeniously they cracked it. But software has existed much longer than affordable internet and greedy corporations. So I wondered, how did people protect their work from copying in the 80s and 90s? What torture devices did Nintendo come up with to make it harder for the Chinese to make those 999-in-1 multi-carts? The answer is, as they say, mind-blowing. So it's 1980. They pass a law that allows protecting games, programs, and other software with copyright. However, a couple months before this, at the end of 1979, the first game using copy protection came out. Microsoft Adventure. What kind of game was this anyway? In the 70s, computers couldn't do graphics yet, but enthusiasts already understood the possibilities of digital format, so they actively wrote so-called text adventures. Remember the movie Big with Tom Hanks? When he started making toys, he immediately understood which way the wind was blowing. Thus, in 1976, programmer William Crowther developed the text adventure game Adventure for the PDP-10 mainframe. These were ancient server cabinets that stood in universities, military bases, and other interesting places. A few years later, the still small indie company Microsoft ports the Adventure to personal computers, TRS-80, Apple II, and IBM PC. And so that unscrupulous gamers wouldn't freeload, they start thinking up ways to protect their goods from them. Text adventures were released on floppy disk, and basically nothing stopped anyone from taking a disk with the game and copying it infinitely. So, how do you stop people from doing this? But for this, let me explain how floppy disks worked. A regular floppy was divided into tracks and sectors, and in a specific place on this disk was stored a file allocation table that the computer used to know from which track and sector to take the files needed for the application to work. Copy programs simply used this table to find out in what sequence to copy files for further recording to a blank disk. But Microsoft was sneakier. Microsoft Adventure had its own custom file allocation table that third-party programs couldn't read. So, when trying to copy the game, it would say the disk was actually corrupted. This didn't work. This was because the track numbering was different from standard. Simply put, on regular floppies, tracks were marked with sequential numbers starting from 0 and so on. Microsoft changed this numbering. For example, track 34 was 61, track 1 was 127, and so on. Microsoft changed the sector numbering on their disks and taught their application to work with such encryption. The company's programmers were very proud of their new protection system, and various magazines picked up the news and started printing tons of articles about how piracy had come to an end. Yes, don't be surprised, as the ancient meme said, "Show me your pride and I'll show you mine." A big adventure fan, Australian Nick Andrews, was so afraid of losing his game disc that he decided to copy it. However, for some reason, this didn't work for him. In the end, the guy spent a couple days studying the protection mechanisms and simply wrote his own decryption program that could read info from the altered track numbers. Later, he even found a way to remove the alternative numbering table. Thus, he went down in history as the first person to crack video game protection, and Microsoft Adventure essentially became the first cracked video game in history. After this, cracking different floppies stopped being something special. For example, there was a very amusing kamikaze hack from the past. In some disks, publishers would make a hole and put the game code in the damaged location. That is, the error message sent by the disk drive was a kind of unlock key. As soon as they started using this encryption method, pirates universally armed themselves with needles to poke holes in homemade disks in the right places. In general, developers needed to come up with something more inventive. Nintendo had a very curious floppy protection system. Yes, Nintendo had a special accessory for the Famicom, or rather the Japanese Famicom, if you will, the disk system, and exclusive games came out for it. Unlike cartridges, copying a floppy was much easier. We've already figured this out. So the clever Japanese started playing in reverse. They changed the form factor of the floppy itself so that it simply wouldn't fit in computers, and so that pirates couldn't feed homemade floppies to the Famicom drive. Every original copy had Nintendo engraved on it. The drive simply refused to read data from the medium if it didn't get physical contact with the indentations on the Nintendo disc. Well, since we're talking about Nintendo here, it would be a sin not to tell about another Japanese invention. In 1990, the game Star Tropics came out for NES. Halfway through the playthrough, the game would simply stop and a message would appear on screen. Tell Mike to dip my letter in water. Mike, by the way, is the main character of the game. Such a strange and vague description made people literally engage in some kind of pixel hunting in the game to understand what the game wanted from them. But this didn't help. The thing was that the game box came with that very letter to Mike, and you really had to dip it in water, after which information would appear on it about what to do next. Essentially, this wasn't anti-piracy protection, but actually protection against video game rental. Nintendo hated rentals, and they even managed to achieve a legislative ban on rentals in Japan. After all, essentially, rental stores would buy a couple copies of a game, and then someone would profit from them while Nintendo lost thousands of sales. Rental places wouldn't give out a game with the box, manual, and everything else. Here's just the cartridge for you, but the letter was critically necessary to complete the game. Those were the kinds of tricks Nintendo pulled. But what did smaller developers invent? One of the first protection methods was banal manual input, requesting data that was in turn printed in manuals supplied in the box with the licensed game. During the game, a dialog box could pop up where you needed to enter a code or word that was specified in the manual. For example, in the strategy game Populous from 1989 by the famous storyteller Peter Molyneux, sometimes a picture of a random coat of arms would appear with an input line. This meant you had to flip through the entire manual, find the image of one specific coat of arms on its pages, read the name of the country it belongs to underneath it, and then type that name into the game. Such dialog boxes really annoyed players. Each time the coat of arms was different, and these coat of arms were scattered on the most different pages of the manual. So you had to flip through the entire manual again and again. Its pages would get crumpled and worn out because of this. And if you lost this manual, God forbid, then your game was over. However, despite the drawbacks, a huge number of games in those years used exactly this protection method. Although, of course, some developers were more reasonable and immediately indicated the page where the necessary information was located. Well, thanks for at least that. Getting around this was all pretty simple. You could just make a Xerox copy of the manual. By the way, even Kojima used a similar method. I think many of you will remember the scene from the first Metal Gear Solid when Snake is asked to call a specific frequency that was printed on the back of the licensed disc case. By the way, I remember when I played the first Metal Gear Solid like 15 years ago, I really got stuck at that part where you have to make the call. I didn't know what to do, and I ended up Googling a walkthrough, and that's where I found out it was written on the box. Kojima is a genius, as we know. Some developers, considering the possibility of making Xerox copies, started releasing manuals where pages with needed data were colored in different contrasting colors so that a Xerox machine couldn't copy them properly. The printouts usually just came out black. For example, such protection was in the game Gods by the Bitmap brothers, and it was even more annoying. Not only Xerox machines couldn't adequately read information from the booklet, but normal players couldn't either. Not only were letters and numbers very hard to see, but the glossy paper also reflected light badly. But the developers of Carmen Sandiego tried to solve the piracy problem in their own way. They supplied a huge thick almanac together with the game copy, and the game itself could ask for information from any random place in this book. Printing such a huge number of pages ended up being more expensive than buying a copy of the game. But publishers had to spend much more money on the game, so the technology didn't catch on. As they say, I'm ashamed to live in a timeline where a game manual cost more than the game itself. By the way, this really reminds me of today's realities with Denuwo. To use it, you have to pay them a hefty sum. You can't just take it for free. Especially creative developers tried to implement such real-life elements into the game that would complement the gameplay. Probably the most famous example is the protection system of Ultima 7. Just listen to this. The game came with a map of the game world. Not only was this a nice souvenir, but it also served one specific function. Before starting the game, you were asked to calculate at what longitude and latitude a certain city was located based on coordinates. So far it sounds simple, but the hassle was that the cities were labeled with runes. So before looking for the needed city, you had to open the manual, find the translation of a dozen runes, and only after that search for the point on the map. and as a final chord, enter this data into the game. Fortunately, this procedure apparently only had to be done once, otherwise it would have been complete trash. But there's really something to this. Nerds in the 80s and 90s were somehow more advanced people, and such powerful creativity. The publishers of the sequel to Alone in the Dark also managed to distinguish themselves with creativity. The game came with a set of playing cards that were needed to solve puzzles inside the game. The cards weren't quite ordinary. On one side was indicated the value in suit, and on the reverse was a set of colored markings and cutouts. At some point, the game would suggest placing the Queen of Spades on the Jack of Diamonds and writing down the symbol from, for example, the 4th row of the 3rd column. There were other tricks as well. Floppy disks in those years had a quite specific memory capacity. Often it was limited to plus or minus 80 kilobytes. This was long before my time when all floppies had 1.44 megabytes. Because part of the data didn't fit on the disk, they simply moved it to the manuals. In the racing simulator for DOS and Amiga from 1989, Indianapolis 500 The Simulation, between races there would be shown a picture of a car or a portrait of a driver. The disc came with an almanac that described car models and the drivers themselves. The player had to familiarize themselves with the provided information, learn more about racing and cars, and then take a test by answering questions like, "Who is this person?" or "What model car is this?" Even though later versions of manual input protection tried to be surprising, they still had many flaws, which is why publishers had to come up with something new. For example, have you heard of so-called code wheels? Some games released in the 80s and 90s came with a small mechanical device consisting of several cardboard discs connected together. Such a cipher was invented long before the appearance of electronics, actually way back in the 15th century, in 1470, by Italian architect Leon Battista Alberti, who used it for encrypting letters. Even though his invention became the basis for video game piracy protection, the devices still worked a bit differently. A number of games, for example Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, came with a disc wheel. During gameplay, a dialog box with instructions would pop up. It would specify several numbers from the outer wheel and the inner one. You had to match these numbers, and in a slot on the bottom disc, a code would show. You just had to enter it in the dialog box. Getting around this was actually also very simple. You could disassemble the wheel into component parts, print them out, and then assemble it back. And now you had not one, but several such wheels. Or you could just brute force and pick the right code from all possible variants. There usually weren't that many. Developers tried changing numbers to symbols to make guessing harder, making the code composite from several numbers. Printing discs in very faded tones so scanners couldn't copy them. But all this was in vain. For every action, there was a counteraction. Back in those same 80s, there was another extremely curious protection method, the hated Lenslock lenses, and the most famous game using this protection was the Space Simulator Elite. It worked like this. The game came with a special lens. During the game, the image would suddenly turn into a random set of pixels with a large letter N in the center of the screen, and you had to place the unfolded lens against the monitor screen, calibrate it so that the edges of the letter N matched the cutouts in the lens. After calibration, you had to fold it according to the instructions and place it against the center of the monitor again. If you were lucky and did everything right, looking through it you would see the key. Needless to say, on bulky CRT screens this was quite a task. Often instead of continuing the game, the user would get a message, "Thank you for your interest in our product. Nice try." The main problem was that all monitors differed in size, which caused the image to distort differently on different models. Where Commodore 64 users saw the needed code, ZX Spectrum users saw suggestions to go, well, you get the idea. The protection worked, but not for everyone. There were tons of people who bought legitimate copies, but simply physically couldn't overcome this anti-piracy barrier. It's unclear how such a device even managed to reach the market. Wild times. My new Elite game came with a Mega device. On top of everything, some devices that came with games didn't match the cipher. They often put lenses from other games in the box, and the protection itself was quite easily removed at the software level. In general, it was a maximally stupid idea that, thank God, didn't become widespread. Lenslock was used to protect only a few projects. A bit closer to our time, in the early 90s, rumors started appearing in Amiga magazines about some device that would soon put an end to the fight against pirates. It was written that the new protection showed itself so well that out of 50 levels of data protection, an experienced programmer after a week of decryption managed to overcome only one. The author of the idea was the then director of Ocean Software, Gary Bracey. Essentially, the idea wasn't new. Already in the 80s, programmer Pete Olson used similar devices with an electronic key on board to protect his word processor, WordCraft. To get access to the program, you had to insert a special device into the 25-pin or 9-pin port on the computer. The software only worked with it. The device was released together with RoboCop 3 for Amiga. Overall, an impressive visual game for 1992. For the game to start, you had to insert the floppy into the computer and then simply connect the so-called dongle to the joystick port. And no matter how much Ocean Software praised their new invention, hackers needed less than 6 hours to decrypt the game's protection code. Gary Bracey immediately started making excuses, saying he knew the protection would be cracked quickly, and all this hype around the new incredible device was raised so that as many people as possible would run to the store for a license. If so, the plan worked. RoboCop 3 sales were very good. Maybe this was still due to the game turning out well. And by the way, the next edition of RoboCop 3 was released without dongles. By the end of the 90s, all the above-mentioned protection and cracking methods completely lost relevance. The internet appeared, people starting exchanging manuals and documentation on forums, sending each other needed keys and sharing information. The era of analog protection methods ended. And then came Starforce, SecuROM, and others you've probably heard about, and I've already talked about them. With all this protection, developers often shot themselves in the foot rather than somehow protecting their game from copying. Protect as much as you want. Pirates will always find a way. And you'll only put sticks in the wheels of those who buy licenses. Thank you so much. See you in the comments. Nothing more to say. Definitely write everything you think about this video. Your stories.